First of all, hi, Jessica.
Hi, Katie.
So nice to meet you.
So cool to say hi, Katie.
Have we never met before?
We met once at Cannes Lions at Patau, 5 years ago.
Oh, my gosh.
But many cocktails deep. And it was just like a fangirling where I was like, Katie Couric's here.
Oh, you're so funny.
So loosely we met.
Well, now I'm very excited that Jessica Tarlov is here. So I guess one of the first questions I'm going to ask you, and then we'll talk about all kinds of things, Jessica, is something that a lot of my social media followers asked, and that was, how do you do it? How do you sit with 4 very conservative people, not every night? I guess you alternate with Harold Ford, right?
Yes. Yeah.
But how do you do that?
It's a two-man job.
To several times a week and keep your cool. And I think it's miraculous. I've watched you a few times. I'm not a regular viewer of the 5.
I would not have guessed that you were. Though we have 22% Democrats that watch.
No, and I do. I like Dana, and I know Judge Janine from my previous life on the Today Show. I don't really know Jesse or Greg Gutfeld. That's a fascinating thing in and of itself. His late night show we sometimes watch because we're fascinated by it.
Yeah. Well, you're not alone in watching it and being fascinated by it. He definitely filled a void in the late night space, I should say, where people didn't want to see 5 of the same guy making the same jokes.
Right.
And he invites on a wide range of people to be there.
Right.
And people are culty about it. I mean, not just the ratings, but how well he performs in the demo.
Right.
Is astounding. So there are young people doing this, and then you look at the election results and you say, well, this makes sense.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, there are 30-somethings that are into this.
Yeah. Well, getting back to you, tell me how you go on, when you go on, and how you brace yourself to be, honestly, a lone voice for sort of the Democratic point of view on that show.
So I will say, and I think it is important contextually, because a lot of people who watch the show or see clips of me flying around, which is how most people with my politics at least experience me, they're like, you mean this is a whole hour? Because I thought it was a 3-minute and 15-second show. And I'm like, no, it goes the whole hour. I've been at Fox my entire media career, so I don't know anything different than being odd woman out. And I think it's prepared me for those more difficult conversations. I mean, a lot of the 5, and I think why it resonates with viewers, is it's pretty light, right? It's 5 o'clock. You're supposed to be hanging out. It's after work for, whoever. It's dinner time for some of our older viewers, right?
You're right.
Yeah.
Or if they're having the early bird special.
Though now it's chic everywhere to eat early.
And now people are maybe fixing dinner or just taking a break from their day.
It's not supposed to be upsetting. Right. It's not supposed to be something, and so much of political commentary right now and just discourse is harmful to your mental well-being.
And enraging.
And it's not supposed to do that. You're supposed to pay attention. And we obviously, the first half of the show where we do most of the red meat political conversation, there are moments that people get amped up, especially when you really care about things. And like you said, there are very passionate players that are part of this ensemble. But we are trying and seem to have effectively replicated what a lot of people know in their real lives, where they have, a Thanksgiving table that might be predominantly conservative, but Aunt Jessica is invited and she's really pissed that Kamala lost or whatever. And there are moments of agreement, right? Where we all kind of come together and say yeah, that doesn't seem right? We can all be on the same side of this. So having been at Fox my whole career, I think it's just more inherently normal to me to be in those kinds of moments.
Well, actually, that brings me to my obvious follow-up is, why have you been at Fox your entire career, Jessica? And what attracted you to that format as somebody whose ideology doesn't necessarily mesh with the vast majority of people there?
Yeah. So my background is in political polling. I have a PhD in government. I came back I did my PhD at LSE in London, came home, and I went to work for Doug Schoen, who was Bill Clinton's pollster.
Right.
And Doug was
And you went to Bryn Mawr
I went to Bryn Mawr,
yeah.
7 sisters forever. I guess
My
we're just...
sisters both went to Smith, and I got
really?
rejected, Jessica. Rejected. What? Not even waitlisted.
Joke's on them.
That is another podcast for another time. But go on.
It's starting that I have young kids, but I have some friends who have kids that are thinking about heading into high school, and they're not thinking about it. They're going to go, and they're thinking about what high schools to go to. And I went to Dalton here in New York City for just high school, and very prestigious, really hard to get into. And they're like, "Oh, how did you make that choice?" And I'm like, little secret, I applied to 13 schools out of 8th grade and only got into Dalton. So I feel you. The other ones are like, we are not taking a flyer.
I feel validated. Thank you, Jessica.
But Smith should feel bad. I love Smith, though.
Yeah, my sisters did, too. And one was Phi Beta Kappa, and they apparently left sisters. So I was really kind of bummed when they
Are you sure there's no backstory?
No, I think it was I wasn't as good a student as my sisters. But anyway, go on.
Anyway.
You went to Fox.
I went to
polling. Well, start with
Yeah, so Doug was a contributor at Fox basically since he got out of the Clinton administration. And he was, as I continued to grow, working for him and learning how to do polling and delving more into the research side, and I'm fundamentally a researcher, he said, I think it would be really good for you to build your media skills. And because he had connections to Fox, he introduced me to bookers, and I started coming on.
But first, your grandparents had met him at the Harmony Club, and basically...
Tale as old as time, the Harmony Club, which is like a very obnoxious, predominantly Jewish club on the Upper East Side. I was finishing my PhD, and my grandmother, like an overbearing Jewish grandmother, went up to him probably while he was at the buffet or something and said, I have a really smart granddaughter. And he's like, I've heard that before. And she's like, no, she's really smart. Give her a chance. And he did, which is how I started working for him. And
good for your grandmother, right? You owe a lot to her.
I do. She's another podcast about the deeply complicated history of Malvina Roberts. But she got me where I was going, and I will always be thankful for that. But then it just pretty quickly was a good fit. I'm a proud establishment Democrat, very moderate by the party standards, Nancy Pelosi, Hillary Clinton type of Democrat, not more AOC, Bernie Sanders mold. And I think that works better with the bipartisan conversation because, if you want to have a food fight, and you remember what cable news was like around once Trump announced, and every night on CNN, it was Anna Navarro losing her mind, right? And Kayleigh McEnany was on in those days, and Anderson Cooper was just kind of sitting in the middle, petrified, right? That's what it was like. But you could have a more thoughtful conversation, and I found myself being able to do that more or less, and it always is embedded. At least for me, coming from a place of understanding that I'm talking to people who generally come by their beliefs honestly. And I think that too many people suppose that folks who they don't agree with don't actually believe the things that they're saying. But most of the time they do. And a lot of that is due to circumstances, how they grew up. I grew up here in New York City. I have had a charmed life. I know where my liberal politics come from and what my lived experience has been. And going to work at a place like Fox, I now have people in my orbit who have a completely different set of backgrounds, who, when they talk about how they feel about the Second Amendment, that comes from a place of growing up with guns and having hunters in their families. Or when they talk about, probably the toughest issue that I ever have to discuss on air, being pro-life or bringing pro-choice, especially in the wake of the Dobbs decision, that a lot of people's beliefs on that is rooted in their religiosity. Where I look at it as a policy issue and a scientific issue, and they're telling me about
also a personal liberty issue.
All of the things that we think about it versus
right.
This is what I was taught in Sunday school. This is what I grew up enmeshed in an environment that feels really differently to that. So that has been enlightening. But basically, it was a good fit, and Fox hired me right after the 2016 election. And so it's just where I've been, and they've allowed me to grow. Suzanne Scott, who's the CEO of Fox, she promoted me 8 months pregnant. to get the hosting job on the 5, which is massive. And you know what it's like. You're completely freaking out when you're with child, let alone publicly with child like that. And will your job be there for you? And they've been extremely nurturing to me. And I think also putting such an outspoken Democrat on, I mean, we've been the top show in cable news for years now, I think says something about the kind of conversation that they want going on their airwaves. So yes, I'm still outmatched. It's still 4-on-1 or 3-on-1. Dana Perino is not.
Well, I was going to say it's that is a real anomaly though in the Fox lineup. I mean, let's be honest. You say that's the kind of show and the conversations they want on their air, but they are really few and far between, are they not?
Well, it's different. A panel show is different than a single host show.
Right. But even the guests and even sort of the...
No one's going to pretend that it's not right-leaning, especially in prime time. I think you could have conversations about what Neil Cavuto does on his show, what Brett Baer does on his show, what Shannon Bream does on Fox News Sunday, and Chris Wallace before her, and know that some of the most productive conversations with Democrats have actually occurred on those shows. And that actually, you know, like Brett, for instance, on Special Report has a segment called Common Ground, where he has on a Dem and a Republican, and the most liberal senators are dying to get out. Like Elizabeth Warren would want to come on Fox to be able to do that. So there are moments where I think actually the fact that it is conservative leaning, you know, writ large, not necessarily those newscasters, creates an environment that Democrats know that they want to be a part of that because also, A, we have the numbers. Like if you're watching cable news, you're watching Fox most likely. And especially if you look at it post-election where MSNBC and CNN has dropped off. And
why do you think that they have just imploded?
I think it's two-parted. I think when you lose, you recede, right? And you go into a hole. I mean, I have tons of liberal friends that are like, I just don't want to see the news right now. You know, like wake me up once he's inaugurated or something big happens.
Or in 4 years.
That's impossible. But, you know, I don't know what Trump 2.0 actually looks like. But everyone, I think, will get amped up again if they're, you know, if the deportation force starts, Joe and Mika's audience is coming back. Right? Like they will want to be part of that. But I think there's fatigue. And I think there's a feeling, and I get this from a lot of people that I know in my orbit who kind of tune out more conservative leaning media and really are part of the liberal bubble, that they were not told an honest story about what was going on in this election, like poo-pooing polls and interviews with people who you wouldn't expect to be leaning towards Trump or considering Trump and being fed a narrative that was not reflective of what happened on November 5th. And I think it's really important as a media person to have an honest relationship with your viewers. I try to do it. Like beating that drum, I wanted people to know Joe Biden has a ton of accomplishments and that he should be really proud of. And that when he stands there and he talks about the good things that he's done for the country, that's an important element of this. But at the same time, to also say this is a jump ball, right? Like there's a tiny polling error in either direction. You're going to have this result. And Nate Silver, who took a lot of flack for this, you know, in his model, the number one most likely outcome was what we saw, that Trump gets all 7 battlegrounds. And then just below it by just a few percentage points was that Kamala gets all 7 battleground states.
Right.
This was a run-of-the-mill result. And I think that people who have been on a steady diet of left-leaning media have a sense of betrayal in all of this because they were told he's Hitler. You know, he's an authoritarian. We're going to get all of these Republicans that, you know, supported Nikki Haley in the primary, but without really, you know, getting into the fact that most people do go home, right? When you look at a full policy platform, it's very hard. I think of it in contrast. Like, what would it take for me to vote for a Republican? It'd take a lot.
Well, I guess the question is, Donald Trump is claiming a mandate. And as a pollster,
I'm not into that.
I know that the numbers just don't add up to a so-called mandate. What do your Fox colleagues say when he repeatedly insists that he has been given carte blanche to do whatever he wants?
They think it's a problem with the Electoral College and the way that elections work in this country, but it is a rarity that a Republican wins the popular vote.
Right.
And he did do that by a tiny amount. I think it's like 1.5% now, and it'll be, I mean, it's certainly the lowest performance since 2000, but I think historically speaking, it's like combined with the Electoral College and the popular vote, like the third worst performance for a winning president. That's not that exciting, right? We're not talking about what Obama did or like a Reagan.
I was going to say there are other presidents
that's never
too.
going to happen,
right?
Yeah, but it's just in recent memory for people who are handicapping this. But yeah, they do feel like he has a mandate. He has the trifecta. He has control of everything. But if it was such a commanding win for the Trump agenda, the coattails would have been larger. And Democrats, I think, did really well in the Senate. I was sad to see Bob Casey lose his race in Pennsylvania. And a little bit surprised by it. But, holding on in Nevada, winning Arizona, Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, Elisa Slotkin winning in Michigan.
Right.
And on top of it, for these candidates to have figured out a way to manage I'll work with Donald Trump when I need to. Tammy Baldwin started releasing ads. It was like, this is what I did with Donald Trump when he was in office. We can do that again. So I always push back on it, and not to diminish what he pulled off, because I think it is a dramatic feat, especially because he took all these Gen Z voters that I didn't expect would go over in those kinds of numbers. But I don't feel like he has some massive mandate. And, Speaker Johnson is going to have to talk to him about the hard truths. He has a 1-seat majority. What are you supposed to do with that?
I want to ask you about the fact that some left-leaning media talked about, described him as Hitler. With honestly, J.D. Vance did the same before he had an epiphany and became a big fan of Donald Trump's, and talked about his authoritarian tendencies.
Yeah.
And you were saying that as if you were dismissing those claims. But I'm curious if you do think Donald Trump has authoritarian tendencies.
I do.
Were people right to point that out?
Yes. I think your strongest defense is always using the words of people who knew him. And so when you have quotes from Mark Milley and John Kelly talking about this, you amplify them. And I did on the 5 as well. I read them. I write. I take copious notes. I do a lot of prep. I read them out loud. I said, this isn't about me. But the reason that I think maybe you read what I was saying as being dismissive is that argument only tells part of the story of how people see Donald Trump, and that this came down to an incumbency election and an inflation election, which happened all over the world, and all of the incumbents got thrown out.
Right.
And that people were thinking about their grocery costs and were not following the trend line as closely as we are, right? They weren't like, Steve Ratner up there with all of his charts to say, which I love. I live off of it. I mean, I use all of this for my own data collection, but they weren't tracking it like that. They just have a memory of the past few years not feeling that good.
They don't care if the bridge they're driving over to get to the Kroger was the result of the infrastructure bill.
No,
all they
don't
know is their groceries are 30% higher than they were.
Or they know both of those things, and you have to pick. And for a lot of people, this felt like a political Sophie's choice for them. They didn't like either. Whether if Kamala had had more time, they would have felt more comfortable with her. I think she ran a very good campaign for getting 107 days. I was not someone that thought a year in advance that Biden should have gotten out. But in retrospect, I think that's probably the case, that we should have had a primary, and that there is a good chance that Kamala Harris would have won that primary. And she would have been able to talk about her experience as vice president and gone ahead.
But they had so much working against them, not only inflation, but they had the border crisis. And she never really could come up with a good explanation.
No, and
except
I've seen
for the fact, which I think is honestly very legitimate, Jessica, that there was a comprehensive immigration bill that took, 8 months for very conservative Republicans and Democrats
James
to hammer
Langford
out. And
is not an open borders guy.
Yeah, and Donald Trump said, do not vote on this bill, because he wanted to use it as a part of his campaign strategy.
I think Donald Trump sucks. Like, I totally agree with you, but...
Well, I didn't say he sucks. I just said he wouldn't let them vote on the border.
No, but
bill.
I'm saying he sucks. I believe that. I think he's manipulative. He's underhanded. He's completely self-interested. I worry he will run the country exactly in that vein. And I'm concerned about it. But on the immigration front, there was a tendency amongst Democrats, and especially Democrats who are discussing the issue, so people who do interviews or are part of the media, to minimize it over the first 2.5 years when there were a lot of people coming in here. And I thought that it was a stunt, when they started busing migrants. They go to Martha's Vineyard.
Yeah.
It was the smartest thing they ever did.
Well, it's interesting because I have a friend who lives in Florida, and I said, what did you think of Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott taking some of these immigrants and moving them to northern states? And she said, I thought it was great because nobody really was paying attention before that. And I do think that this untold story was the strain on social services and communities, particularly along the border, this huge influx of immigrants was having. And I think the mainstream media, however you define that these days, kind of ignored that story to its peril.
Not only ignored it, but you could make a good argument that they were protecting Biden from this. That it was like, I would rather talk about how where inflation is coming down faster here than it is for anyone else in the G7 and all of these very good things that were actually happening than deal with a crisis, which is an everyday horror show. For like Eagle Pass, Texas, cannot take 10,000 people a day. And it's wrong for us to ask them to do it. And Democrats like Mark Kelly, Henry Cuellar, screaming about it. And it led to a point where some of these border state Democrats didn't want to be linked with the administration on this because they knew that it was being so poorly handled and that we didn't have a good solution. And I agree with you, that comprehensive bill, which James Langford wrote, was one of the more, with Chris Murphy, but James Langford is one of the more conservative people in the Senate in a genuine way. This isn't fake conservative populism. This is the real deal. But that still came 3.5 years after this crisis really amped up. And the speed at which we have been able to cut down on border crossings, like because of the executive orders, and President Sheinbaum of Mexico was touting this in her letter back to Donald Trump when he threatened the 25% tariff on her, where he said border crossings down 75% because of the work that we're doing in conjunction with the Biden administration. That's all well and good. But to the average voter, they're thinking, well, why didn't you do this before? If it was an executive order and you didn't actually need congressional approval to do it, why didn't you start with that?
Right.
The second Title 42 was lifted.
Right. And their answer to every question about immigration was, well, early in the administration, they had a bill and they couldn't get anyone to do anything about it.
We didn't think it was a big enough deal.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And you're totally right about the social services. And I've spoken to a number of people who not only, have the daily experience that I do. I take the subway in and out of work every day. I'm probably one of the only people on camera that does that. And so I know what the subway is like now, and I grew up here in the city, and I know what the difference is between that experience. But when classrooms are filling up with kids who don't speak English, and you have community centers like all over, big cities like Boston, community centers that are built for underserved kids who need somewhere to go after school, and they're being closed down to be turned into migrant shelters.
And you have hospitals that are overwhelmed, and I think I even talked to Mark Thompson at one point and said, why aren't you covering this? And I thought it was interesting. I also told him that I thought during the election, they should have bureaus all across the country in smaller towns, in rural communities, talking to people about, all kinds of issues that I think surfaced during this election. So it was largely an immigration and inflation election. But I'm curious if you think sexism also played a role in it, because I went to a doctor and I said, gosh, I think Donald Trump may win this election. She said, well, we have two terrible choices. Mm-hmm. She just doesn't have the stature to deal with world leaders. And I thought, wow, that was a female doctor.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you think that sexism is still an albatross around the neck of many of these female candidates, especially when it comes to the highest office in the land.
Yeah, I definitely do. I think that there are considerations that go into the life of a professional woman on any level that men never think about. Like, it was very cute when Doug Emhoff at the DNC said, I like her laugh. But we don't care about men's laughs, right? And we rarely notice what they're wearing.
Right.
And I know everything. I know every pantsuit that Hillary wore, and I know about all of Kamala's fashion choices and all of it.
She really made, I think, an intentional decision to be, even though they were beautiful Chloe suits apparently, to be as nondescript as possible.
Very understated.
Right.
And, I'm sure you remember when Trump went after Nikki Haley saying her dress was ugly. Nikki Haley purposely leaned into her femininity in a way the Democratic candidates don't typically. I think the only skirt Kamala won was when she went to Sunday church, which is to a black church, which is what you're supposed to do, I am told. So I think it is part of it just in what people take in about the aesthetics. But if we're being honest, and I see no reason not to be, the first couple of years of the Biden administration, I don't think she performed that well in public arenas, and that people had that as their perception of her. There was this moment she was sent to the Munich Security Conference probably about 2 years ago, a year and a half, 2 years ago. And she gave, I think, one of the best defenses of our support of Zelensky and the Ukrainian people, of NATO, Western values, democracy, and going after totalitarians like Putin. And she got praise across the political spectrum for it. One of those moments where the five is not, not adversarial, where even Janine is like, that was a good speech. That's what we're about here. Mm-hmm. And that moment and ensuing moments where I think she did well, I think especially in talking about the Dobbs decision and the implications of that, she did a great job. But those moments came too late. And I don't know the inner workings of whether she was not amplified on purpose, so that it was really Biden's administration or
right. I agree. I agree with you 100%. I don't think she was.
She was not nurtured,
and I don't think she was showcased in any way. And part of it, I wondered if Joe Biden's discomfort in being in spontaneous media situations, they didn't want to then prop her up for fear that she would overshadow him.
That's interesting. I actually hadn't heard that.
You can use that on the 5 today.
I will. I'm taking you. I'm going to be like, my pal Katie told me this. I think,
that's what I wondered.
Well, also once, as this autopsy is being written about what happened, and you realize just how small Biden's circle is. Smaller than even presidents that have small circles. Like we're talking about, Mike
4 or 5
Donnelly,
people,
Steve Ricchetti,
Anita
Dunn, Jill, and Hunter. Essentially, are, making all of these decisions, like dropping out of the race, pardoning Hunter. We don't know. I mean, it could be one person's feeling.
It really will be interesting to find out,
if we ever get to it. Yeah, I'm fascinated by it. And there's, part of me who feels, as someone who was very defensive of the administration, not just for petty political reasons, but because I genuinely believed in what we were doing and thinks that we've created a recovery that's unprecedented.
Why do you think Biden gets so little credit for the things he has achieved? Is it all about the aesthetics of his ability to communicate, to use the bully pulpit properly? Because I think I saw someone railing against the pardon, saying this will, maybe it was James Carville, that he's going to be have the lowest approval rating of any president in history. And do you think it's a communications problem? Do you think it's a perception problem? Do you think there are things that are actually, legitimate to criticize? I mean, what do you think is keeping him from getting credit for anything, really?
I think that he proved himself to not be as much of the empathizer in chief as we thought that he was. Like in the 2020 primary, I thought he did that really, really well, where people thought this is a guy who's on our side. This is a guy who hasn't jumped the shark. He's not saying, health insurance for everyone who's here undocumented. We should have open borders. He seemed like the common sense candidate. Him and like Amy Klobuchar, right, who I love, and can't get out of a primary, but would be an amazing president for sure. And it is a communications problem. I think he wasn't able to toe the line of being able to speak highly of what they were doing and to also say, I know it's not enough right now. I know what your life looks like.
Right. He couldn't really feel their pain like Bill Clinton did.
No. Well,
and I wonder why.
No, because I think he genuinely does.
I agree. I think he's an incredibly empathetic person.
Frankly, about being destroyed on conservative media constantly. And his accomplishments being belittled and people talking down about him. I mean, this guy has run for president 3 times. He obviously believes that he should be there and that he has earned a level of respect that he did not feel that he was getting for being able to do these things, for being able to work with conservatives when he needed to, make sure that we have investment like the CHIPS and Science Act. What happened? It was a skinny version of the bill, but the Inflation Reduction Act, which a lot of people still mistakenly say was what spiked inflation, and that's absolutely not true.
I don't know. I've read enough stuff that at least it might have contributed. I'm no economist, Jessica, but an influx of that much money. There are some that argue that really wasn't helpful to the economy. But again,
including
I'm not an economist.
Justin Wolfers, who worked in the Obama administration and is a great liberal economist. What I'm saying is that when you look at where the inflation numbers are now, there was a temporary pain that was unsustainable for people. But they were looking at it on a long curve, and it seems to have come back down to a palatable level, but people went and voted feeling like inflation was 15%. Not that it was 2 or 3.
Do you think historically that Joe Biden will be considered a better president than he's believed to be at this moment in time?
I hope so, for his sake. I think, unfortunately, the decisions that he made around what to do in terms of running and kind of more social, like the Hunter pardon and whatever is to come. I think if he goes around blanket pardoning anyone involved with the January 6th committee or things like that, it'll get even worse for him.
Sort of those preemptive pardons. Right. But I don't know. Listen,
but for
you
what?
Listened to that interview on Meet the Press with Donald Trump basically saying Liz Cheney deserves to be in prison.
And Benny Thompson.
Jail.
And
I mean,
and Kash Patel has an enemies list that he published in his book.
So why would that be so bad to
But what are you pardoning them for?
Well, I think that a lot of people don't want him to pardon them because it's an admission they did something wrong when they were actually just holding
Schiff
people accountable.
Has even said, don't.
Yeah.
This sets a terrible precedent. And for what? We weren't on the wrong side of the law. And I'm glad that he has faith in the system, that it'll protect them. I'm not so sure if you get through all of these confirmations. And Pam Bondi is obviously better than Matt Gaetz.
But a lot of people say not that much.
I don't think
he sexually assaulted underage girls, but
no, I don't
as far as we know,
she did not do that. But no, she was on the election denialism tour with a lot of these lawyers and was out. I think she gave a press conference in Philadelphia talking about, all the stolen votes and all of that. And none of that is good, but you have to reassess your standards, I think, for what he's doing, with a few exceptions. In terms of foreign policy, I am very happy.
Yes, a lot of people are. I think everyone.
I'm friends with Mike Waltz, who's going to be the national security advisor.
I think people think he's fine. I think they think Marco Rubio is fine. It's these other people like Fox's own Pete Hegseth. And I'm curious how you feel that Fox pretty much ignores the story. They invite his mother on Fox and Friends. But when it comes to all these allegations that are pretty serious, honestly, from drinking to sexually assaulting women to driving an organization into the ground to all kinds of things, Fox kind of ignores them.
At least in the last few days, every time that I look up at a screen when I'm in the makeup chair, Pete is on it. And there's a gaggle around him, and they're covering it. I think the first mention was Chad Pergram, who's a great reporter of ours, and it was on Brett Baer's show, The Straight News Show. And it was mentioned there, and there has been ensuing coverage.
But you know what I mean.
I do, and I don't. It's ongoing.
You're not running Fox News, and I'm not asking you to defend the editorial decisions, but it just does seem weird to me.
I take your point. I know Pete loosely, have been on with him. He's always been very pleasant to me. I think the allegations are serious, and you see people like Joni Ernst, who's obviously taking them seriously.
Although now she's kind of switched and said that she had I'm paraphrasing, a great
good
conversation.
Yeah, it seems
as
like
she continues to support his nomination or
whatever.
whatever.
I think that saying that someone should get to go before the committee isn't the same thing as saying this is okay.
Right.
And there was a very strong argument to be made that a president who, certainly in the mind of Republicans, has a big mandate should get to have his nominees come through. Like someone like Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton, released a statement saying, I expect that they will get their hearings and that they will get confirmed. And he's someone who's a complete neocon, like normal hawk, right? Like a Mitch McConnell, but younger. And he's even saying that. And I think that
I think we haven't really heard from Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski.
No.
And they only need, right, one Republican?
No, they'll need
How
three.
Many? Three.
So, because J.D. Vance he
Right.
can vote. So, yeah, would I love it if Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski just stood up and said no to 75% or whatever? Yeah, I think there are different threat levels that each of them are posing. And I hate that someone who I think is as dangerous as like an RFK Jr. getting as the head of HHS is now like a shrug to people because they feel like I have bigger fish to fry here. Like
right.
Tulsi Gabbard is interesting.
I know that you said something about Tulsi Gabbard. You said that, I guess, what did you say about her? That she was sort of your hair on fire pick. Top anxiety pick.
Yeah. Peak anxiousness about Tulsi Gabbard. It's been interesting because I feel like she hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but then there was a story that came out yesterday about the meetings that she's been having with senators and that apparently it's not going well. So if it's just undercovered and she ends up being not confirmed, fine by me. I don't need to hear about it all the time. But, watching the scenes out of Syria the past few days and thinking back to her defense of Assad. Which is the original. I think that might be part of. That was probably from my podcast, but I spoke about her on the 5 a couple years ago, and I said I am not in the business of accusing someone of being a Russian asset. That is very serious, and it got us in a whole host of trouble in 2016, where about Trump, and that backfired. But they like her too much, and they talk about her on Russian state TV. And I think a commentator had even said recently, like, she's the only good one left in this. The only one that gets us. Because Marco Rubio doesn't feel that way about Putin or Assad. And Mike Waltz certainly doesn't. So Tulsi is very concerning to me. But I don't know. Like, Bernie Sanders has said that he might support her and RFK Jr., which seems like a complete betrayal of a lot of his beliefs or what I thought that they were. But I don't know. I believe more in Lisa Murkowski than I do Susan Collins. She's always deeply disturbed by things and then, votes for them. So it's going to be a mess. It's going to be good TV programming, though. Definitely. We're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask you just a couple of questions in closing. One, there's so much hand-wringing and introspection about what the Democratic Party needs to do now. And Chris Murphy, who I'm interviewing this afternoon, I think said, that they need to be more populist and come up with really a different strategy. I mean, as somebody who's been steeped in Democratic politics for a long time, what advice would you give the party? Well, it's hard to do it if you're not naturally prone to be able to, but speaking like a normal human is a good one. And rewiring, I mean, I've heard a lot of people, and there's a huge rise in the number of folks who identify with a third party, right? Who are just like, I'm an independent. And then it's usually an issue like being pro-choice or something that sways you in one direction or the other. But I would love it if we could kind of strip the title Democratic Party off of it and just common sense party. What does your heart tell you about X policy or X position that you might be taking? And I think that would serve us a lot better. We certainly wouldn't have gotten into this mess with, the ad that had the most impact on the election was the they, them, you ad with Charlemagne in it. And it was an ad about trans issues, but it was mostly an economic ad, right? It was basically saying the Democratic Party is taking your cash and putting it towards something outlandish, right? That no one thinks about, that affects one person every 5 years, maybe, right? The sex changes for undocumented people in jail. That is the smallest subcategory you could probably ever come up with. And That's
interesting, but you think it really translated to a feeling of being economically ripped off by government.
100%. This is where your dollars are going. They do it about migrants. They do it about foreign policy. That's how they've turned people against the idea of giving money
to Ukraine
and in some cases to Israel. I mean, J.D. Vance even voted against the Israel funding package, which I know he's on board now that there's a new sheriff in town and he's part of that ticket, obviously. But I think if you just let yourself be governed by your gut more than your party affiliation, that we would do better. Because a lot of these people who were interviewed, and I'm sure you saw some of these interviews as well, like the former prison guard, or sorry, I shouldn't say the former Democrat who is a prison guard, who was interviewed about why he had voted Hillary, Biden, Trump. And he said, the Democratic Party doesn't like people like me. Or the woman who was in a focus group who said, they asked, what words would you use to describe the two parties? And she said the GOP was crazy and the Democratic Party was preachy. And she said, preachy doesn't work for me. I can handle a lunatic better than I can handle a party that makes me feel bad about myself.
Right.
And we made a lot of people feel bad about themselves.
Yeah, I got to know someone who's covering the Trump campaign, and I said, what is, you go to a lot of these rallies, what do you think is really motivating? And she said, the lefty lecture culture.
Yeah, which frankly is me. I mean, a lot of the criticism that I get from the right, and, I think now I'm just part of the ecosystem and they've come to accept me, but, I have a PhD. I wear signature glasses.
You went to the London School of
Economics.
Yeah,
I sit up there lecturing you about your
You went to Bryn Mawr and grew up in New York City, went to a private school.
All of it, like limousine liberal to the max. And I sit up there and sometimes go off for, a full minute at a time about Biden's accomplishments. I did it just yesterday. I said, we were talking about what his legacy would be, and my colleagues were crapping on him. And I said, you know what his legacy is? The best recovery in the G7. That's what his legacy is.
And what did they say to that?
Jesse was like, we're moving on. I take all of those as a W when they just say moving on. But I would like to be more common sense about things. I would like to speak in plainer language.
Well, I know you do a podcast with Scott Galloway called Raging Moderates. And there was a time when being a moderate was so out of fashion.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you think as a result of this election that suddenly we're going to say maybe it's not so bad to be moderate, but how do you fight sort of extreme conservatism, which has been pulled over to the right, with moderation? Because it seems like the whole idea is to get people all worked up, right? Yeah. And moderation isn't very sexy, Jessica.
No. But I think that if the number one thing that people took away from Kamala's campaign, which was she's too left for me. And part of that was they did a great job at amplifying clips from 2019
Right.
and 2020. And then
Right.
Kamala didn't want to deal with them.
Right.
She
And
didn't sit down and say, like,
she
I
never
didn't
really answered those questions
no,
very well.
And obviously the View question from Sunny Hostin that was the nuclear explosion. Like,
Yeah.
how are you different from Biden? And I saw you speaking about it where you're like, how do you not have an answer to that?
Right.
And Biden doesn't seem to me to be someone who would be aggravated if you said respectfully, we did a lot of great things, but this is what a Kamala Harris presidency does differently.
Yeah. We don't know. We don't know how
No, but
he would have responded to that.
But
Who
what's he
knows?
going to do to her? We also have to think about not only winning back the white working class, I shouldn't say white working class voters, but there are moderate Republicans and centrists that do not want to go home to the Republican Party. Even if the top of the ticket in 2028, it shouldn't be Donald Trump. God knows what he'll do. But let's say it's some J.D. Vance or other. They want to be part of a pro-democracy party. And we are that. And we have to be reasonable to be able to integrate them and make it easy for the Liz Cheneys of the world to want to be part of us, not just when there's someone with, authoritarian tendencies, I think, to be, fair about it at the top of the ticket. But when they're running a normal Republican to just say, actually, what the Democrats are selling resonates with me. And they're better for the economy. And they respect people's personal liberties. And they're not insane.
It seems to me that you are a perfect role model for people on how to get out of their bubbles, how to have conversations with people respectfully, with compassion.
I'm writing a book about it.
Well, you should,
Yeah.
because, and I'd love
I'll
to
send you a copy. It will be down the line. It takes a long time
I
to write a book. I did not know about the schedules of these things.
Yes, it does. I can attest to that. But I really think that you would have a lot to say about respecting people, having conversations, meeting people where they are, and not ending with a food fight at the holiday dinner table.
Yeah.
Because I think we really need that if we're going to solve some of the thorniest issues that are facing our country.
Yeah, I hope so. And I appreciate the compliment. Thank you. I take it really seriously. And I know that also for a lot of people around this country, I'm the only Democrat that they might know in their lives, right? Because there are people that are siloed. And I think it's so important to represent the values of this party that I care deeply about in a sane and approachable way where, they can't write me off as someone that's lost their mind or someone who can't say something that's obvious. And obviously I have my moments, where I am over my skis as far as they're concerned. But generally speaking, I think if you had my colleagues on, they would all say I'm just like a pretty moderate, rational Democrat.
Do you all ever have dinner or
Yeah.
go out for drinks?
Double dates. I go out with Jesse Waters' wife on my own. Janine, I've recycled the story now, but Janine, who has a grandson around the same age as my oldest, who turns 3 today. Happy birthday, Cleo. Got me baby formula when there was no baby formula. She knew a guy. I don't ask questions when Janine says, I know somebody, I can get you that. But it is genuinely the messed up family that you see on TV. And I really appreciate that and the opportunity to get to talk. I talk to 4.3 million people a day about what Democrats are doing right or what, frankly, translating the perception that they've gotten through people who are not being honest brokers with them or a communication system for the party that I think really failed. And I hate having to start a sentence with I would have said it this way. I'm not auditioning to be press secretary or anything like that. But, you know what that's like, where you're that's actually not
helpful.
It's not helpful and it's not the truth. It's not what the policy actually does. It's not what happened at X event,
Yeah, definitely. Well, I could talk to you for hours.
Yeah,
but
this is so nice.
Thank you so much for being on this podcast. Thank you for what you do every other day, I guess, on Fox
2 or 3
News.
days a week. Yeah.
And I feel like you should probably have your own show where you talk one-on-one with, should I call Suzanne Scott?
Yeah. Great.
Do I get
gonna
10%?
I mean, CAA is going to fight you for it, but yeah. Go
Great
to work,
to be
Katie.
with you.
Yes,
Thank you,
for having
Jessica.
me. This was great.